And welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio, broadcasting across North America, both on Sauga 960 AM and on Big Talker. So we're very delighted for our next guest, someone that I've wanted to have on for a while. Bit too nervous to ask, but now we've got something to promote. Ain't that wonderful? We're talking to Noah Rothman, associate editor of Commentary Magazine and the author of the brand new book, The Rise of the New Puritans, Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun. David, this is exactly all the topics that we cover each and every week, so it's a pleasure to have Noah on. Noah, thank you so much for being on the program.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. So we're going to get into the book here. We took some notes. This is going to be fun. There's a lot of different things that you mentioned, but I wanted to get your reaction quickly to your recent television appearance. I know that you've written this book. It's very thoughtful. You have a very interesting thesis discussing Puritanism, the origins, how it applies today. And you brought this over to MSNBC, where I know you're obviously a commentator. And they didn't really seem to engage with the ideas too much. And the narrative that came out is the real Puritans are those on the Supreme Court. I think your thesis is beautiful in that it does not really touch on politics. But really, what is your kind of response to that? Because I think that was that seemed a bit far charged in those first few minutes when you're trying to promote your book.
I don't know. Well, first of all, I'm very grateful to everybody at MSNBC where I work, and I'm friends with everybody over there. And then Joe blurbed my book, very gracious of him. So, yeah, I think there was a little bit of pushback there, but it's important to have some of that pushback, in part because this narrative is going to be resisted. When you think of somebody who's priggish and prudish and who sees in innocent cultural products the engine of society's destruction and your corruption, you think of the right, because that was conventionally where this sort of disposition was. And for most of our adult lives, the contrast was struck by left liberals who emphasized self-fulfillment, self-gratification, even hedonism. And that was the dynamic that we grew up with. And this began to change very rapidly over the course of the last decade. We are treated now to moral crusades engineered by the left, entertainment companies that pledge to impose, plotting didactic narratives over entertainment products so they serve a higher social purpose, sports programs that digress and labor over the lamentable state of racial dynamics in America. The food you eat has to be accompanied with understanding about cultural affinities, and perhaps your cultural appropriative, fusion dish should be, have some didactic moral with it and a lesson about the cultures and what have you. So it's not like you can enjoy anything anymore. You have to be taught and about why the thing that you're enjoying is probably kind of terrible and has very terrible origins and is rooted in all the sins of America's birth. This is a moral crusade, and it's a familiar one. It's as progressives identify less with liberalism and more with progressivism, they've adopted its habits of mind. Among them, the hatred of idleness. The idleness is an idle vessel can be filled with the devil's influence. It is wicked. So you and all your activities must be dedicated to the pursuit of the development of the ideal society. This is a social organizing philosophy, and it's accompanied by great displays of discomfort and anguish and pain to communicate your zeal and commitment to the cause. So when the left is confronted with this, yeah, they're going to reject it because they're going to say, look, it's the right that's waging culture wars. And they are. The problem is that that's not new. If I was writing a book about the old Puritans, that's what I would have written. There would have been a searing insight in 1988 to say, well, Republicans are cultural revanchists. They are. And yet now liberals are too. That's a new story. And frankly, it's a much more interesting story. It's the one I'm telling.
Yeah, and I love the part here. For the new Puritan, ruining your diversion is the whole point. Unnecessary recreations are a luxury you do not deserve. And you kind of talked about this at various points in the book, discussing that, the real focus, what's really important is, quote, agitating for the left-wing political goals. So it's in a way to where we have this private sphere where we have sports, we have culinary, figures, we have fashion, we have this entire world that's not infected with the politics of your job or perhaps my job. But now all of that is crossed over, and there is no such thing as the private sphere anymore. It's kind of been infected with this new Puritanism, as you label it.
Yeah, there certainly shouldn't be politics in these ventures, and the problem is there are. So the origins of this book is that I was miserable in 2020, late 2020, just like all of you. We were all miserable. In depths of the pandemic, months out from the riots, the whole of society dedicated to a redefinition of what America was, is, and should be. And so I'm sitting around with my wife and I'm saying, well, covering politics is just a chore. It used to be fun. I used to enjoy this. Now it's just miserable. And she said, what do you want to do? Well, if I had my druthers, I talk to people in industries I enjoy. I talk to working comics and chefs and sports broadcasters and entertainers and playwrights. But no, I can't do that either, because everything is infected with politics. There's no getting away from it. I'm just destined to be miserable. She goes, that's the book. And it was the book. This book is not about law, not about politics, properly understood, government. It's not about education. It's not about the workplace, unless your workplace is where you produce cultural products. This is about aspects of society that are supposed to exist a priori politics, outside of politics. And they have become politicized by virtue of this rediscovery of an old moral value that is being repossessed and espoused by progressives and left liberals. But this is a value system that has a lot to say for it. I organized the chapters in this book by unimpeachable virtues: piety, prudence, austerity, temperance, a fear of God and order. These are things that are otherwise valuable for a society that is dedicated to its own self-preservation. It's just unnatural to see it being advanced by the left. And it is not the values themselves, but the means and methods by which they are enforced and imposed on you in the most zealous of fashions that ultimately detract from their cause and make your life miserable.
So my one follow-up question here is, in many instances, we've talked about horseshoe theory, that the fringes on the left and the right are closer together than our politics would seem. And for a long time, on the issues that you're talking about, I mean, I go back to the Dixie Chicks and them being scolded for ridiculing George Bush back in the day. You raise a very good point that this type of moral purity was very much a Republican staple, and now it's both. Do you see this as like another affirmation in regards to that horseshoe theory, that on these fringes of moral crusaders, both left and right, progressive and conservative, that they end up actually being closer to each other than we otherwise would think?
Most certainly. And the purchase that the fringes get now, I think, is an outgrowth of this phenomenon, because we have reconceptualized the fringes who dominate the dialogue. We have reconceptualized politics as something that it's not. It's not legislative affairs anymore. It's not electoral outcomes anymore. It is things with political themes, but exist outside the realm of legislation. They cannot be resolved in state legislatures or in Congress. So we establish for ourselves a set of conditions that cannot be met. That we have these systematic, system-wide phenomena that are unacceptable, that are unjust, that cannot be remedied by government, and that are consuming you. So you work yourself up into this froth where you end up in one of two psychological places: one, very depressed and despondent, and you withdraw from politics because the conditions are such that so immiserating and they're so unresponsive to politics that it's just a chore to even dwell on them, and you disengage. The other psychological phenomenon is you radicalize. You resolve to attack the foundations of these wholly immoral and unjust institutions that cannot respond with the urgency and alacrity to what you regard as an absolute moral imperative. So what we're left with are the fringes in the dialogue. Everybody else is withdrawn. And, you've seen a lot of these, op-eds about people who are like, I'm so exhausted. I'm just exhausted by the conditions that have beset me and the country. Not too exhausted to write an op-ed in a major city newspaper, but exhausted enough to complain about it. But they are speaking for millions of people who genuinely have dropped out of the process. The problem is the people that are left are the most radical, the most zealous, the most uncompromising. And those are the people who define our political dialogue today. That's in a natural condition, but it's one that's been brought about by this misconception of what politics is and what politics can achieve.
Yeah, they got to do the work. We'll get into that a little bit. I wanted to read one passage here, very pertinent to what we do day in and day out. And by the way, Noah, a huge fan of your writing. I think you and Kevin Williamson are, I think you're two of the most talented writers on the right. So
Thank you.
definitely
High praise.
Yes, love that, and listen to the podcast as well. Commentary podcast. We'll give that another promo here. So here's the quote: "Moral crusades do not end in victory. They rarely end at all. Devilry can never be vanquished. Its influence merely transmutes into unfamiliar forms, whereupon the battle against evil begins anew. And so it was that the Oregons dedicated to stigmatizing the combustion of tobacco products turned their attention to a device that contains no tobacco and involves no combustion, specifically the practice of vaping. And their moralizing forebearers, the campaign's objectives relating to public health, are at best a secondary consideration." So you've probably seen on Twitter, Noah, the Vape Nation is paying attention to your book. They love it. They understand exactly what you're talking about. They're fighting this battle each and every day. Why is it that the new Puritans have sort of changed their focus to try to vanquish vaping from our public consciousness? What's that all about?
Well, there's two aspects to this. The first is sort of mission creep in institutions. And I wrote a piece for commentary on this, which informs that bit of the chapter that you were reading from, that there really was a genuine, not a conspiracy of the sort that you would see in the Oliver Stone movie, but a conspiracy of shared interests among pharmaceutical manufacturers who own the patents on every nicotine replacement therapy, and the anti-smoking industry, and the government, to stigmatize and to anathematize and ultimately get rid of this, what is a smoking cessation tool, albeit unrecognized, in part because it was just not controlled by the right people. Now, that is one aspect. The other aspect is this moral crusade, which a Surgeon General's report in 2000 ultimately identified the effort to stigmatize smoking as being a moral crusade, and actually becoming an impediment to getting people to drop the habit because of America's latent hostility and antipathy towards moral crusades. This is, again, a sort of an invention of the baby boomer generation, the sexual revolution, when they assumed that the commanding heights that they had seized, this center-left leaning philosophy, that they had evolved beyond moral crusades. They had evolved beyond moral panics. We have not. This campaign against vaping, which is very dubiously scientifically justified, has elements of a moral crusade and a moral panic that are impossible to ignore. One of the biggest examples of this has struck out at me in a line that connects it directly to 19th century moralism and Puritanism of the early 1700s, late 1600s, is this one study that identified late onset degeneracy in adults who vape as children, that you will grow up to be a layabout, a burden on your society if you were to indulge in this habit. And states have gone about criminalizing this conduct in ways that are incredibly excessive, that produce police violence in an unnecessary degree, that saddle children with misdemeanor convictions or felony convictions, so that they don't offend worse later on in life. I mean, this is a collective mania. It is a moral panic, and it's not all that dissimilar from what the Puritans experienced. Puritans were very hostile to smoking for the most part, and for practical reasons, because the mishandling of fire is something that you didn't want to encourage in the colonial period, but also for moral purposes. This was an act of idleness. And idleness, just like any gaming implement like dice or cards, tobacco was something that corrupted you, not just your humors, but your soul, your person. And we see this in how we talk about vaping today among the activist class. And I found these parallels so difficult to ignore that I could not fail but to include them in that chapter.
One of the case studies or examples that is mentioned is a clothing store in a place very dear to my heart in Canada, in Toronto. Essentially an instance of, in summary, of an accusation of cultural appropriation, because certain people whom were not one race were making a food or providing a food of another race. My own viewpoint on all of this craziness is, I mean, that is kind of the beauty of a multicultural society. You have an Indian family own a pizza place and all of these things. Where do you think some of the insanity around cultural appropriation and food comes from, and why do we see this as such a failure and not a success of that melting pot of different people living peacefully together?
Sorry, I was muted. Some of this, I think, is informed by a general impulse towards cultural competency, which is not a bad thing. The general instinct toward inclusivity and sensitivity informs the sentiments around this. The language and the activism around it is informed more by a desire to prosecute professional jealousies and to establish borders and boundaries for your society that are inviolable and that create and sustain order. And in the manifestation in which you talked about it, it has just resulted in the outcome, the final product was to deprive you of something nice. It was to sell, you can't now shop for athleisure wear in the store permission that I was citing there, and have pho and bone broth, because that's somehow in a zero-sum game mentality detracting from Asian cultures. A Portland food truck that sold Mexican food from Mexico, where these two women had traveled and learned and brought the recipes back and were very good and were feted in the local press for their acumen making this food, was destroyed because it was perceived to be stealing, physically stealing and theoretically stealing in a sort of metaphorical sense from the cultures they were actively promoting in a very good way. The restaurant in Chicago, Fat Rice, which was the best restaurant in Chicago, according to Chicago Magazine in 2015, was destroyed by its own employees, or at least its former employees, not because the chef was a particular prima donna, which he apparently was. That's described as industry standard behavior. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it is. But because it had, quote, taken from Black culture. Now, I'm not sure how Black culture has anything to do with the city of Macau, which is situated on the Pearl River Delta in China, but it was perceived to be that way during 2020 at the height of this mania, and that destroyed this restaurant. People, a big host, is being deprived of something they like by a much smaller host. And it's perceived to be out of a value system that has something to say for it, and I do my best to be charitable in the book. But it is also manifesting in ways that are entirely unproductive and are sowing the seeds of its own destruction because a backlash is brewing.
So again, we're speaking with Noah Rothman, author of the book, The Rise of the New Puritans. And there's one quote I absolutely love, and I've had these saved. It's Noam Chomsky on sports when he talks about jingoism, irrational jingoism. And I remember he did some radio interview where he talked about listening to sports radio for 15 minutes, which I cannot even imagine him doing that. But listening to these guys calling in with the most arcane stats and all of this about the batting average and all that, and he goes, this is all just jingoism. It's his own thing. And the point I wanted to bring up here is that, the thesis is very powerful. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people would just be drawn to controversies of the book, or they're going to tie it to the current political narrative. But there's a lot of very, very important lessons about looking at the old Puritans and how this kind of American flavor or North American flavor of liberalism actually helped, keep that in check. And a lot of your book covers the narrative of, quote, the liberals, the left eating their own. What do you think of this sort of left liberals who reject the premise of the New Puritans? Do you see that there's some force there? Do you think these are the people that perhaps those of us who might be libertarian or consumer advocates on the right might want to perhaps partner with them? Is there any hope there?
Yeah, there is. I would think so. At least when it comes to cultural issues, conventional politics as we understand it, law, economics, foreign affairs, that's outside the scope of this book. This is about the stuff that should exist outside politics, and therefore there should be broad apolitical coalitions around it. I wouldn't be surprised by that, because 9 of the 10 people I spoke with are Democrats, identify as liberal, wouldn't vote for a Republican if you put a gun to their head, but also resent the phenomena that are sapping them of enthusiasm for their life's work. In the sports arena, there's just the parallels between that and late 16th century Puritanism are just impossible to ignore. Puritan society had a real problem with anything that was physical but didn't have a martial dimension to it. So like archery or shooting, or even marathon running, that sort of thing. But when it comes to football, I mean, what we would sort of see as a proto-genesis of football, it's not exactly the same thing, but it has enough similarities that you can recognize it, was anathematized and basically outlawed in the colonies and during the late 1500s, early 1600s in England, because it had so many odious features that nobody could ignore. It was violent, it was bloody. The Puritans outlawed blood sports and sports involving animals. It was jingoistic, as you say. It encouraged reckless consumerism, frivolous consumerism and overspending. It encouraged dressing up in costume, which was odiously similar to performance art, which was utterly banned. And that's the sort of thing you see in modern critiques of sports culture from the puritanical left. The sports distract from more important activities like your studies. Sports encourage violence and toxic masculinity and violence against women. Puritans were very attuned to violence against women and punished it accordingly, and had no brook for that. And similarly, as you said with Chomsky, and I quote him and I quote some others who say, well, ultimately, this is just a distraction from the great work of our time, which is organizing for progressive change. All oars must row in this direction. This is the great project of our time, the creation of the ideal state and the ideal society. And anything that distracts from that is worse than worthless. It's evil.
Do you feel that in some sense this is just an aversion to the affluence of the time in which we live in now? Like the way in which I hear you describe some of this, I mean, sports in North America, I'm a huge Blue Jays fan, Toronto Maple Leafs fan, football fan. I mean, all of that is enjoyed because we have a relatively comfortable quality of life. We have more time for fun. What part of that aversion for affluence or the desire for us to regress or the degrowth movement as we see it, do you see that intertwined into some of the critiques on fun, on all of the things we enjoy with our spare time?
Yeah, most certainly. We do create a lot of our own controversies. We invent crises in order to mobilize around a response to those invented crises. A lot of this is a problem of idleness, and it's a problem that will unfortunately not be around forever, because there are and will be legitimate crises. But yeah, we do create a lot of our own social phenomena that we rebel against, and this book is full of them. But there's also, the problem of progress itself. Going back to the food chapter, there is a strain of, particularly on the socialist left, that rejects modernity entirely. And that manifests in their frustration with the phenomenon of the miraculous phenomenon of the modern food system that feeds the planet and sustains the ever-growing population in ways that critiques of population growth could never have imagined. They just simply did not foresee or would not foresee technological innovation that allows for an ever-increasing population. There's a Times piece that I quote there that discusses the way in which we treat food as a commodity, and the way in which the modern food system has allowed for people who can't afford food to go hungry. And this is this horrific system that we're taking too much and we're sacrificing, we're making other people sacrifice. It's greedy, it's imperialist, and it's immoral. It would be immoral and an atrocity if the modern food system was forcing people into starvation. It's the precise opposite. Since 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the development of the first global economy since 1914, more than almost 1 billion people were lifted out of the depths of extreme poverty, defined as about living on $1.25 a day. Malnutrition worldwide has declined from about 10%. I think it's 19 to 10%, 11%. And this is attributable to modern economics, the global trade system, and of course, the triumph of capitalism as the primary theory of economic organization. Quality of life has risen across the board, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa, where attitudes towards genetically modified crops based on a campaign, an information campaign designed to stigmatize and anathemize genetically modified crops, has been very successful. They have not taken there. And as a result, malnutrition still remains frustratingly high, in part because of this designed effort, quote, late empire and hedonism, in this one piece about America's love of food, to convince everybody to forego progress, to forego technology, and to sacrifice and suffer as befits a person who is properly understands the miserable conditions in which we live. You cannot escape these miserable conditions. Otherwise, you're not a well-educated person. You're probably not a moral person. You have to dwell on the world's horrors at all times and in all things, and is making for misery. And it is a prescription for misery. That's not really a sustainable thing unless it's imposed on you by the public square, and it is. But you have to suffer this burden yourself. You have to put this burden on. Your instinct is to slough it off. And I think that instinct is going to win out eventually. But for now, the admonishment and the shame imposed on you in the public square is sufficient to get you to close your mouth. My hope with this book is to give you permission to open it.
I love it. It's been opened, definitely. Noah, one of the main reasons I wanted to bring you on is because all of these topics that you mentioned are things that David and I, as consumer advocates, we're kind of pushing against every single day. You bring up the examples of gene editing. It's something that the UK has finally liberalized, obviously off limits in the European Union. Everything related to vaping, trying to defend that. There's all kinds of taxes that are imposed on things like sugar. There's all kinds of bans on, different plastics that people use, and it's all ingested into sports and comedy and all these different things. Knowing how the last movement of Puritans ended, whether it be through constitutional structures, through some type of competition, or people finally were able to get rich, what kind of advice can you give to those of us who are battling against this, either politically or socially, knowing the lessons of sort of the downfall of the last Puritans? Do we have hope in rising up against the new ones?
Yeah, I do. I mean, my prescriptions are individual, to live a joyful life, to have permission to mock these people who are behaving in ways that are utterly hilarious. The only thing that stops you from laughing at this behavior is fear, and that fear is illusory. But also, I have hope for just environmental conditions will have the effect that they had centuries ago. So when we think of the stereotypical Puritan, scholars of Puritanism hate this. You think of probably more something aligned with Victorian ethos, the mid-19th century, a mainline Protestantism that informed early progressivism. The Puritans themselves get a really bad rap. They weren't nearly as puritanical as our stereotypes would maintain, but the progressives of the 19th century most certainly were. And one of the downfalls of that theory of social organization is illustrated in the phrase "banned in Boston." So Boston, the heart of mainline Protestantism, the heart of progressivism in this country, waged several moral crusades against impious and impure literature, most notably organizing around the Comstock laws, and the moral societies that were founded to combat Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, for example. This really subversive piece of literature. And so this was very successful in Boston well into the 20th century. Plays were banned, books were banned, songs were not played on the radio. Entertainment was bawdlerized. And this was an effective way of communicating to the public that they should stay away from this sort of titillating literary experience for a time. But then eventually there was a backlash that grew against it. And ultimately, as scholars contend, Banned in Boston went from being a warning against impure literature to a powerful advertisement for it. Publishers actively had tried to get their books banned in Boston to increase sales around the country. And I think the modern equivalent there is banned on Facebook or banned on Amazon. Anytime you have a conservative book, and they are mostly conservative books that find their way off online realtors or aren't able to be advertised on Facebook for this or the other really kind of fatuous concern about the influence they could have on society, on you, that we don't really trust, those sales explode in ways that the PR campaigns and the publishing investment around them don't justify. It is the controversy around that, the scandals when they happen, that advertise these materials and undermine the goal of these censorious 20-somethings in Silicon Valley who think that they know better what you can and cannot consume. So there are environmental conditions that will also erode the strength of this movement towards depriving you of things you would otherwise enjoy if you had the free will to enjoy them.
No, that's it. And you heard that, folks. If you're offended by all the things in this book, which I know I am, you should write to as many people as possible. It should be canceled. The book is The Rise of the New Puritans, Fighting Back Against Progressives' War on Fun by Noah Rothman.